quality communication. Yesterday, Canadian minister mentioned International Women's Day. Actually, part of Ukraine, I guess, still is getting slowly drunk by the end of the day, because we have 4 days holiday in Ukraine today. And while thinking about how to respond to that fact that some countries do celebrate, and how to emphasize the role of women in society, because in Ukraine it was highly ideologically overloaded, I still decided to start my speech from one phrase of one of well-known and very strong politicians and strong women of this world. I mean Margaret Thatcher, who once said, "You may have to fight a battle more than once to win it." And it's very closely related to the issue which I am supposed to discuss today, the state of democracy in Ukraine and the perspective of democracy in Ukraine. It's very relevant to what we are going to speak about. In 1991, I guess we got independence more as a gift of history, though generations of Ukrainians have been fighting for this day. Many of Ukrainians have given their life for the independence to happen. But in 1991, we got it as a historic gift. In 2004, it was another democratic victory for Ukrainians made by the courageous Ukrainian people who went into the streets and defended their basic democratic right, the right to have a say, to have a choice, to have a right for fair elections, for their votes not to be taken away or to be falsified. In those years, I guess we believed, and I personally believe, that Ukraine is gradually and continuously stepping up the ladder of democracy, and that we would be only coming higher and higher to the world standards. But as it appeared to be, it was not so much democratic ladder as a roller coaster, or what we call American hills in Ukrainian reality, with ups and downs, thrilling sensations, and when you are thrown back at one point, you are at the bottom of the coaster, and then you are running very high. And again, I understand this will be a continuous process. While talking about democracy in Ukraine, I wanted to start from analyzing or thinking aloud rather on how the world influenced on democracy in Ukraine. World and democracy, world and its influence on democracy in Ukraine. Naturally, as somebody who was Deputy Prime Minister for European integration, I would like to start from the EU role and EU impact on our democracy. Probably many of you have read, because I've seen it on my internet, on my Facebook, and on my mail, references to the famous letter of 5 European Ministers of Foreign Affairs, talking about or evaluating the state of democracy and European perspectives for Ukraine. Their basic message is very simple. Ukraine or Ukrainian leadership should forget about any real progress with EU integration until that moment when leaders of opposition are in prison and when basic democratic values are neglected in Ukraine. But it is important for all of us to understand where we are standing now, the role or the impact or the potential impact of that agreement, which is practically ready to be signed, which is called Political Association and Free Trade Plus Agreement. Because this is first time in Ukrainian history with EU, where we have the document which summarizes the negotiation skills of a few generations of Ukrainian chief negotiators and diplomats, including Boris Tarasuk, who is sitting right here, and many others, diplomats and trade negotiators who spent 5 years of hard negotiations trying to find all possible solutions and compromises to make that agreement a reality. What makes it different from the action plan, for example, which I have signed as the Deputy Prime Minister in winter, actually roughly in February 2005, which was called Ukraine-EU Action Plan? Because this agreement, Political Association and Free Trade Agreement, has a number of commitments for Ukrainian government to stick to democratic values, to reform economy, to have legal reform, to have judicial reform, to have other reforms which are making Ukraine much closer to the EU and which can gradually give Ukraine that so much awaited perspective about which we are talking so much. So this is the first document which is ready to be signed, where Ukrainian government would have very clear commitments. At this point, we have a Shakespearean dilemma: sign or not to sign, signed or not to be signed. And it is highly debated even among Democrats in Ukraine with certain reasoning. If agreement is signed, are we not sending the wrong signal to Yanukovych government that with all his, in reality, anti-democratic and contra-European policy, he is giving a kind of support for his policies? I can speak on behalf of the many experts which have signed a number of open letters to EU urging for that agreement to be ready and to be initiated. It's important terminology, not to be signed, not to be verified, but to be initiated. Because if the document is not initiated, if every page of this multi-thousand pages document is not verified, it actually does not have the form of the document. But when it is initiated, and both government and President Yanukovych and the experts I've been meeting from EU side, high-ranking officials, are saying that technically it might be happening somewhere in the middle of March. It won't be a pompous procedure which the Ukrainian government expected at the last EU summit, but what we might have a document ready to be implemented, provided that there is maybe different government in Ukraine, something which happened with Ukraine EU Action Plan. The plan which I have signed was prepared a couple of years before Orange Revolution, but EU was not willing to give that opportunity for President Kuchma, who was not known as very pro-European Democrat. So what might be happening, we can get the document initiated, and it may wait for better times. It could be a strong motivation for new types of Ukrainian politicians to adhere to democratic values and then to have that right and that perspective of joining or ratifying that kind of document. Speaking about external factors involved in Ukraine, it's impossible not to mention Russia, and I don't want to swim into James shared territory. I know he is probably one of the few very exquisite, very eloquent British commentators, so deeply feeling and understanding the mysterious soul of Russian policies. But standing here, I cannot simply fail to mention and to speak about Russian factor and Russian influence on the state of democracy in Ukraine. I would start from Putin-Yanukovych personal relationship and what does it mean for Yanukovych, who was publicly saying that after Putin gets re-elected, the relations between Ukraine and Russia will gradually improve. It is clearly wishful thinking. I can tell you this as somebody who was talking about Putin, with Putin about Yanukovych, and you should have seen Putin's body language when he mentions that name. And one can easily predict that after coming back to power, Yanukovych, Putin would probably double, if not triple, his efforts to make sure that he is in full control, and he would never forget Yanukovych, the humiliation of 2004. What does it mean for Ukrainian democracy? What does it mean for Yanukovych regime? Yanukovych regime tries to say, and it was campaigning with the slogan "better relationship with Russia." You know what they did from the very beginning. This was their major campaign issue. So one can easily expect that doubled efforts for Putin to take full control over Ukraine's economy. At one hand, he would be meeting resistance of Yanukovych because this is the guy who believes that taxes must be robbed by taxes, or in this case by Donetsk Indians. I don't know how to say it, but you understand. And therefore they are defending their right to rob Ukraine's economy themselves. But they're really in very difficult position, and they lost alliance and strong support both in Russia, both in EU in the United States, and I have no doubt in Canada. What other factors are influencing Russian factors influencing Ukraine and state of Ukrainian democracy? It is clearly energy. Why Tymoshenko is in prison? What is the formal explanation? That she has signed the agreement which practically is impossible to be implemented. That Ukraine is paying so high price for economy, and that formula, so-called gas formula, which is now fixed and which is strongly defended by Russian diplomats and by Russian policy, makes the price for Ukrainian gas higher than that for many European countries. And the Yanukovych government is saying it's not fair, it's not economically justified, therefore the damage to the economy is so big that that agreement must be revisited, or that contract must be resigned. And therefore all the Yanukovych team is negotiating on lowering the price for the gas. Actually, Russian position is very firm. First, this is illegal and binding document. Second, we can negotiate some reductions in prices, but you have to offer us something. Huge mistake of the Yanukovych government was immediately after coming to power, just giving away everything to Russians. Namely, dropping the idea of Ukraine's perspective of NATO membership, something which Russians have been prepared to pay dearly for, and secondly, extending the rent for Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. So there is no cards in Yanukovych's team's hands to play with, and what they believe would be totally making Russians happy appear to be just a small appetizer for growing appetite of Mr. Putin and his team to try to get absolute control over Ukrainian economy. Security. It's amazing what recent changes we have in so-called strong ministries. It's actually all people with official background in KGB. Again, you have Valentin Rybachuk here, who will be, I'm sure he will be speaking about changes in security. But for us, for Ukrainians, for experts, when we see those new ministers of interior, of secret service, of military, of defense, we are shocked by their background, by their typical Soviet mentality, which they don't even pretend to hide. So the security issue is really a hot one. You can imagine that the head of Yanukovych's personal security is the guy who is said to still have Russian citizenship, and who was awarded by Russian Secret Service for his, he was awarded just recently after serving as a chief bodyguard to Mr. Yanukovych, like he's head of his personal service. He was awarded high award for contributing to better bilateral relations. It's a bad job for Ukrainian security, and this guy is very influential. He's one of the family, and some of candidates which have been appointed in key positions are his personal recommendations. One cannot mention religion, or so-called Ruski Mir, or we would say Rossiyskiy Mir project, which is now very actively and boldly implemented in Ukraine. I mean, the fact that newly elected Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, spends months and months in Kyiv blankly propagating this Ruski Mir idea with slogans that we are all members of Russian world. If you speak Russian, you are a member of Russian world. Therefore, we have to stick to the same values. And one of the major pillars of Russian Orthodox religion is that Putin is given by God. It's like Tsar was given by God. It's God-given gift. So you have to pray for him. And the Ukrainian church, just yesterday I read in the news that Ukrainian church in Lavra, one of the biggest maybe religious sanctuaries of Ukraine, they are praying for Putin's health day and night, because this is the guy who contributed most to them, unlike other Ukrainian politicians. So this becomes highly politicized, very dangerous campaign, which actually tries to get to squeeze out of Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which we call Moscow Patriarchs, any Ukrainian-minded bishops or priests. And the latest developments where they practically removed from the top position one of the Ukrainian patriarchs. I'm not very strong with right terminology, but I'm talking about Volodymyr, who is metropolitan, because patriarch can be only in Kremlin, naturally. And still they removed him. They removed him, and not let's say not in legal way, which is one of the scandals opening up and broadly discussed in Ukrainian press. Another external factor which is of strong, which has a strong influence on Ukraine is the United States. And famous United States and Obama's reset policy clearly had a strong impact on democracy and on behavior and mentality of Ukrainian government, and also on that of Kremlin, because it was highly discussed, highly disputed in Ukraine, and still is, what kind of signal US administration was sending to Putin when they publicly announced this reset policy. I remember how it was discussed and how it was presented in Ukrainian corridors of power, but specifically in Russian corridors of power. To what extent that was giving Russians their legitimate right for influencing their near abroad, something which they publicly emphasize every time there is any discussion with EU or Americans when we discuss any initiatives, including free trade agreement or Ukraine-EU agreement, near abroad, and this legitimate right, some combination of words which I simply hate. When I hear it from German diplomats or from European diplomats, I would like to know what kind of legitimate right we are talking about. What is that legitimacy? But what I like to emphasize that probably our suspicions or the fact that we've been slightly afraid of the impact of US on the Yanukovych government now is practically neutralized, because what we have on democracy in Ukraine, finally we have consolidated voice of State Department and of Brussels, and it specifically started when when leaders of political opposition got into jail. So United States Department and Brussels and the whole world is talking finally in one voice. We should think about what kind of impact does it have, a real impact does it have on Yanukovych government, but the fact that the world is no more united on this issue is there. And I would emphasize another initiative of State Department which positively impressed me, the fact that State Department pronounced civil society as their strategic partner. And I was there when Hillary Clinton announced this initiative. It is not only about Ukraine and Ukrainian civil society, but it's global initiative. And we feel how it is working out. For example, we have Thomas Media here, I guess he's somewhere here. He is the person who introduced high-level civic dialogue to government relationship. You know, Ukrainian government is not very keen and excited to discuss rule of law, democracy, etc. So there were not much initiative coming from Ukrainian government. But what we discussed in State Department and what Thomas Media personally did is a great deal. Now every time we have a high-level working group, next one would be somewhere in May, of Ukraine and US government discussing top issues. That meeting of that working group is one day preceded by top-level expert dialogue between Ukrainian NGOs and American think tanks. And we identify most burning issues which are of concern for the society, and we include them on our agenda. We have a say on agenda for meeting between US government and Ukrainian government. And like it or hate it, Ukrainian government is discussing it. Ukrainian ministers, which might not have any time or desire to visit any expert meetings or to hear to any expert advice in Ukraine, were humbly attending our meetings because there were Deputy Secretary of State Department sitting the whole session, and they had to put it on their agenda, and they had to implement it or to imitate implementation. But we are carefully watching in Ukraine. So it's not just one day event. Between one working group meeting and another working group meeting, we fixed all the promises or commitments made by the Ukrainian government, and then we monitored how they implemented. And by the time of next meeting, we show, we do our monitoring report, what is the progress achieved, and it enjoys a lot of public attention, and it's clearly the example of how public pressure or civic pressure could be effectively used to upgrade the quality of policy. I think personally that similar approach is very much possible in Canada, because when we were discussing what Canada can do, how Canada can increase its influence, it's clear that it's not so much about trade, not so much about high level of government contacts, but the fact that Canada is the country where Ukrainian issue or Ukrainian topic is attentively looked by both by government and opposition. You know, I personally felt that when I was witnessing at international committee hearings in Canadian Parliament, I was positively surprised that there was good intention, genuine interest, and desire to help coming both from government in opposition and opposition in Canadian Parliament. I know that in April there will be high-ranking delegation of Canadians visiting Ukraine, and we discussed with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and some of Canadian MPs the possibility to use that visit to create this similar dialogue which we have with Americans, between civil society and government. Probably finally I should come to democracy and Ukraine, how democracy is perceived in Ukraine and what influences democracy in Ukraine. Obviously, I would start from Tymoshenko factor. That factor is also present in the way how the world is looking at democracy in Ukraine. To my mind, it's clearly simplified, it's easier approach, because we can see everywhere portrait of Yulia Tymoshenko behind the bars and information about other politicians being in prison. But the things are much more complicated, because the question we are asking ourselves, let's imagine tomorrow Yanukovych let her go. Does it mean that democracy will be reinstalled in Ukraine? Clearly not, absolutely not, because it's much more complicated. When we speak about state of democracy, we have to say that there are only 0.2 non-guilty verdicts in Ukrainian courts. 0.2 not guilty. So calculate 99.8 court hearings are finished with guilty verdict. And we are talking about thousands or hundreds of thousands of people being in jail without any justification. About civic activists put into jail for openly protesting and defending their human rights. We can say about journalists who might be put into jail for publishing some investigating information about government. We can talk about many gross violations. But the fact that opposition leaders are in jail is simply outrageous. It is so outrageous that the whole world is united around this idea. What we would like to say, and what is very important for us and for all us to understand, is that it is clear that Yanukovych and his regime, they must go. They are a major threat for democracy. What is worrying us very much, the quality of opposition, or is there really alternative, something relatively different, clean, modern, and different from present regime coming to power? There is very encouraging sign which is now happening in Ukraine. Opposition is talking about unified list. Unified list is something we are all very much supportive of. What we are worrying about, on what basis, on what criteria, how those people are getting on that list. Is this the agreement between some of party leaders? Is the society having a say on that quality, or are we going to have another turncoats which we definitely know are now having ambitions and possibility to get onto that list? So I'm coming back to my final sentences maybe, or conclusions of why actually I am where I am. Why I am not a member of any party. Why after resigning from top government position, last 6 years I stay in the civil society. The reason is that I clearly understand if you are talking about new chances for democracy in Ukraine, it's not about registering another, we have 200 parties in Ukraine, another party in Ukraine, or getting myself or some people on different party lists. It's about changing basic minds of voters. It's about society really learning from Maidan, the disappointment, understanding that their role is not only to shift responsibility on somebody, but their role is demand and push for better quality of politics. What happens in Ukraine nowadays, party of the region is losing votes desperately, but opposition is not gaining those votes. Why? Because people do not see substantial difference, or they do not see what kind of politicians would be running with opposition slogans. For example, I was absolutely shocked by the fact that Alexander Volkov, if you know, it's very notorious politician who was called managing director of Kuchma's parliament, is now running for this campaign on the list of Yulia Tymoshenko bloc. And this is agreed by. And so many, these kinds of people who now try to put themselves in the position of alternative to government, there are plenty of them. So this is why we launched this Chestnut campaign, or Filter the Parliament, or Clean the Parliament campaign, where we are saying to politicians, listen, if you would like to have our support, if you would like to enjoy our trust, you must open up. You must meet basic core democratic values. They are simple. If you are not meeting those values, if you have on your list dirty people, corrupted people, you have no chance to say that you are alternative. And only if society will take that position, there will be much better chances for democracy in Ukraine. And generally, I think that democracy in Ukraine is like weather in Canada. When I arrived here, it was -20, -21. Tomorrow it was very warm and spring is finally coming. Democracy as spring is unavoidable, but we have to be prepared to win many more battles. Thank you.